In this video, we're going to talk about the subject of temptations. Temptations are all around us. The money, gambling, excessive indulgence to food or gaming, and there are also temptations involved between men and women. So what does I Ching say about temptations? In hexagram 44, Chance encounter leading to a moral dilemma basically is a hexagram that's describing the entire experience of dealing with temptations. From the beginning where the temptation is present to later stage where subject has experienced enough temptations, he knows what to do, he knows when to stay away. So let's look at overall behavior of this temptation experience. In line 1 or phase 1, the source of temptation is present. Phase 2, subject handle this temptation gingerly and stay low key. Phase 3, the interaction is getting deeper with the temptations, so there are many dangers and the subject look awkward. By phase 4, there are opportunities for subject to accommodate the temptation further or to leave the temptation. So there are critical decisions to be made at that phase. In phase 5, the source and the subject both recognize there are genuine feelings involved in this interaction, so they must be handled carefully under the righteous framework. By phase 6, the subject has gone through the previous up and down. Enough experiences tell him to how to stay away from something that looks like a temptation, then minimize the chance of the encounter. So let's go to each phase a little deeper. So phase 1, temptation happened right at the source. Let's look at the hexagram. The first line is the in line, which signifies that temptations appears in subtle ways. It's not being labeled, hey, I'm the temptations here. It's not on the surface. Therefore, it's an in line. And there's a yang line at the line 4 presenting the echoing configuration. That means the subject can move through this phase naturally and swiftly. This experience of phase 1 experience with temptation is agonizing because it's getting worse and worse as the time evolves. As you can see from the slope from our quantized I Ching, the slope is negative. That means the auspiciousness is getting worse and lower and getting worse and worse. So the experience is a worsening situation. So what if the subject say, okay, wait a minute, this is temptation, I'm not going to take this. So he bring out to the surface, calling out the temptations and publicly disengage from such temptation. That will actually change the narrative from hexagram 44 to the yang line, the first line, change the yin line to yang line to become hexagram number 1, which is propelling creative evolution. So that's pretty good hexagram to get into if you reject the temptation from phase 1. But most of people cannot resist the temptation and will fall into the temptation and entering phase 2. So all in phase 2, the subject and temptation source all knows that activities may have broken the moral standard, and that's how it feels like of temptations. And as the quantized I Ching indicate, this experience is getting more and more negative still compared to phase 1. And in this phase, what's even worse is that the line 2 and line 5 does not have an echoing configuration, so it's going to be a grind to go through. While the slope is negative, experience is negative, but it's a grind to even go through this phase. That means subject have fallen into the temptation, that experience is not getting any better. What if the subject say, wait a minute, this is temptation, I'm going to stop it now. Maybe I just disappear. I will just hide myself away from temptation, effectively getting away from it. Well, in that kind of behavior will signify as phase 2 yang line changing to an yin line, from what's interacting on the surface into disappearance, and that will change the narrative from hexagram 44 into hexagram 33. And hexagram 33 is the wisdom about retreating. Well, that sounds pretty appropriate for this kind of a retreating behavior. If the subject still cannot resist the temptation in phase 2, he or she will move into phase 3, where the interaction now is more pronounced. The yang line represents the subject continue to act out with the temptations, but the awkwardness comes from the improper nature of the relationship with the instigator. But by this time, it was low-key, but by phase 2, it was low-key. By phase 3, it's getting to semi-open, so it looks awkward on the surface. Line 6 is a yang line, so the lack of echoing configuration signifies that this phase is still a slow grind, and it's getting more negative. Look at that, the average and ending still more negative even compared to first 2 phases. So the negative slope indicating experience is worsening even further. Well, what if the subject in this phase cannot take it further, cannot take it any longer, and decided, wait a minute, let's stop, and we're going to stop this interaction suddenly, maybe cold turkey. Well, what if that happened? Look at the yang line in that case was a open interaction, all of a sudden cease all activities. Well, because both sides are deeply involved, it actually changed the narrative from the 44 into hexagram number 6, which is using litigations to resolve disputes. That means if you're going to have any kind of resolution, it's going to go through a public fighting, just like a litigation. So that's certainly not a pleasant experience. Not only you're going to grind through the disputes, but you are also going to act out your awkwardness in public. So in phase 3, both subject and instigator have adjusted to the challenging realities. But after a while, opportunities to separate from the temptation start to appear, because both sides start to feel a little bit tired. In that sense, the subject moves into phase 4 of the temptation. In phase 4, subject has the opportunity to distance himself from temptation and subsequently proceed into phase 5. So there are some critical decisions to be made at this phase, and the testing subject's determination to break with the instigator. There is a echoing configuration between line 4 and line 1. That means in this particular phase, the subject can actually move along naturally and swiftly. So let's take a more detailed look what kind of a critical decision we are making here. As you can see here, by entering phase 4, there's an opportunity to keep the distance now. But why do we have an opportunity? Because previous bad experience had worn away any excitement associated with the temptations. So once both subject and instigator enter this phase, the decision to be made is this: does subject want to seek instigator again? If the subject does, it will go back to phase 3 or phase 2. So that whole vicious cycle start to keep circling in the previous phase, where we already say it was a slow grind, it's very painful sequence. But if the subject decide to leave the instigator, then he face another choice. Well, when I leave, should I change the narratives? Change narrative means that, how do you describe what's already happened so far? Well, you can change the hex 57, which is edification, which we indicated here. It was a solid line, but at this time, I not only leave the instigator, I change the narrative, saying previous experiences are just lesson learned. We should all repent. We were wrong. The promise to God that you will never make the mistake again. Things of that nature. So you can change the narrative by changing the yang line to the yin line. Basically, changing this to an edification process. as a lesson learned. So, example of changing narrative. For example, you repent, declaring past as lesson learned, or let's say you have a money temptation, so you can say, oh, I changed my perspective on money. I value the family and relationship and people are more important in my life than money. So when you do that, you will move into hexagram 57. But basically, you are changing your previous line from the yang line to the yin line in phase 4. But if you do not change the narrative, you acknowledge the temptation, the interaction exists, do you recognize that, and let time and distance brew, then subject can proceed into phase 5 of the temptation experience. So in phase 5 and 6 of the temptation experience, basically the subject and the source both recognize there are genuine feelings involved. So by phase 5, subject already experienced the cost of temptation. He knows all this negative costs associated with temptation. But he also recognized that there were genuine feeling for that temptation to happen. So handling temptation carefully, but it gets harder as the engagement time lengthens. Look at the experience here. Its slope is negative, even though the average is positive. But if you conduct phase 5 for too long, you will get to negative. What is that? Because it's harder and harder, and try to stay away from the genuine feeling that caused the previous iteration of the temptation. That's why we see a slope being negative in phase 5, but averaging is positive. That means we acknowledge our unrighteous behavior from the past. We decide to change ourselves, but such change is harder to do as time moves along, and that's what caused the negative slope. So by line 6, from very far away, subject is barely involved in such an encounter. Not taking any action shall result in no regret. That's because after first 5 phases, by now subject has enough experience and wisdom where if he senses anything that resembles temptation, he will stay away from it. He would stay away from the beginning. After having gone through all the ups and downs, subject had developed immunity toward temptations. Such self-restraint can lead to ever more positive experiences. Therefore, the line 6 is positive in slope, very positive in slope, in fact, and a very auspicious reading throughout the phase 6 of temptations. So whenever we face temptations and we fall into temptations, we have a reason. For example, I fall into temptations of monetary abundance. That's because I suspect the temptation I may get rich. So let's look at from I Ching's perspective. If you are going through hexagram 44, are you likely to end the hexagram in a narrative that represents wealth and abundance or getting rich? There are a few hexagrams in I Ching that's clearly associated with wealth and abundance. There are hex number 9, number 14, number 26, number 11. If you want to go to hexagram 26, garnering moral strength to advance in mankind, basically by 26 you have accumulate a lot of wealth and can do a lot of good things with it for humanity. But again, require you 44 to change to hex 1 at the beginning, then change again to hex 9, and then change to hex 26. To change to hexagram 11, which is building peace and prosperity, many people like this hex 11. Again, we need to change to 1, 2, 3, 4 times to get to hexagram number 11. So from the overall look at things, if something is associated with temptations, it's not likely to lead to wealth and abundance. That's what this chart is telling us. How about if let's say I fall into temptations for a relationship between men and women, I fall in love, outside the marriage. Can this temptation lead to joy and a strong family, or commonly called can I live happily ever after with the from the experience of adultery? Okay, well, if you are going through 44, how do you get to hexagram 37, which signifies building upon family foundation? You need to change 3 times. Another hexagram that signifies joy is hexagram 58, obtaining joy the righteous way, because those are representing joy that's sustainable. Well, you need to change 1, 2 again. You need to change 3 times. So it is hard enough to make change in one line. Changing twice or even 3 times is so hard to do. So in conclusion, we can derive from such an analysis that if something that is associated with a temptation, it is not likely to lead to long-term joy or nor the strong family. So what conclusion can we derive from above analysis? Well, hexagram 44 is not a set of comfortable life experience to go through. The first 4 phases are full of setbacks and awkwardness. Things start to go your way only at phase 6, where the subject proactively stays away from temptations. But before getting to phase 6, there are plenty of traps where subject can bounce around and the difficult phases for a long time, such as we earlier mentioned phase 4. If you fall into temptation again at phase 4, you may go to phase 3, phase 4, phase 3, phase 4, and you can just run in circles there and get trapped in that circle for a long time before you decide, okay, that's enough, I gotta leave. So there are traps involved in the whole experience of the temptations. If one starts with the temptations and wanting to get rich or long-term joy and or stronger family, then it requires that person to say no at phase 1. And that's why we had in these 2 analyses, notice the commonality that in order for 44 to change to any of these auspicious hexagram in money handling, you need to change to hex 1 to start with. And same goes with changing to joy and family, you got to change to phase 1. That means you got to say no at the beginning. Looking at this analysis from the other angle is that if we meet someone who can refuse temptations from the start, then that person can be a worthy target to develop long-term friendship and partnership with.